Okay guys, good morning. It's Miss Sanchez. We are going to begin today's lesson. Today is Monday, May 4th, 2020. I'm going ahead and starting to kind of figure out the background situation with the lighting and stuff. So I thought we would try our lessons this week outside. Okay, so this week for ELA, we're moving into the Inca Empire. The Inca Empire was a very powerful empire back. The empire was very powerful. They had a huge strip of land in modern-day Peru. They were amazing engineers, architects. They created many works of art, nature. Their society still lives on today through ancestry and heritage of civilizations from years to come, from when the Incan Empire fell to where they are today, where even though the Inca Empire fell, it didn't mean that its heritage and ancestry ended. There are still Incan people and in modern day Peru today. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. The first part of the lesson today is we're going to introduce our essential question. What do you predict will be great about the Inca Empire? So there's two things that we can highlight in this essential question that will help us answer the question. So let's see, the important points that will help us answer the questions, and that will kind of dictate where we're going to go ahead and go with our answers. So let's read the question again. What do you predict will be great about the Inca Empire? So predict, what does that mean? Predict meaning, what do you imagine? What do you believe? What do you think will happen when looking at all of the information as a whole, right? So before we go any background information and read this week's stories, we're going to talk about how do we feel, what do you think will happen? And we can use our background knowledge from what we've done in the past 2 weeks, right? In the past 2 weeks, we've discussed the civilization of Egypt, the civilization of Greece, and the civilization of Rome. And all of these civilizations in their golden age, right, that we talked about, where they had the most advancements, most achievements that left a huge mark on our world today. So what do we predict about another civilization, another empire that we're discussing will be great about the Inca Empire? Does anyone know anything about the Inca Empire? Has anyone ever heard of any major achievements that was left by them? Has anyone ever heard of Machu Picchu? That is a huge landmark monument that was built in the Incan Empire that is still today, that you can go and visit in Peru, and it is an incredible feat of engineering and architecture that we can still see and view the ruins today. That is a major achievement that came out of the Incan Empire. You can also look at what will be great about the Inca Empire. So looking back at the other civilizations and empires that we discussed, Rome, Greece, Egypt, right? Those are all big name powerhouse empires that have had lasting implications and successes on our world to this day. So if we use our background knowledge, we can assume that the Inca Empire is going to have these successes that these other civilizations had. So what will be great about the Inca Empire? We could say, we could say their government, we could say their art, we could say their literature, we could say their architecture, all of these things that we talk about in every civilization that we've discussed through Egypt, Rome, and Greece per se, we've discussed these four different, categories, right? Architecture, art, literature, government. All of these, I want to say, points have been kind of like an umbrella over the achievements that were created and discovered during those periods or those golden age of those civilizations. So if we're looking at what will be great about the Inca Empire, we can predict that they had huge achievements in those four areas. So it's interesting to see how we can take other information that we have read earlier in the past 2 to 3 weeks and use it to predict our story for this week. All right, so really quick, I want to kind of talk about annotating in text. So annotating is basically going through the text and pulling out key pieces of information that is crucial to help us understand what the text is trying to say. So we can have our central idea of the text, right? What is the main point that I'm supposed to get out as the reader from reading this information? So if I read a story about a galaxy, what am I supposed to take out of it? As a reader, what's supposed to happen for me when I finish reading this story, right? So that's the central idea. What about looking at background information, or what about looking at evidence in the text? So if I'm reading a story about the galaxy, what is the author going to include that makes me believe this information? What information is going to be included in the text that allows me to believe and to understand the concepts that that the author is introducing? So annotating text is important because it tells us and it shows us an easier way to break down the information. Sometimes when you're looking at text, especially when you're looking at historical texts or informational texts, such as what we're reading these past few weeks about these ancient civilizations, the words, the information can be kind of hard to comprehend and hard to understand. So annotating is a way for us to break down the information so that it's easier for us to understand. And it'll be easier for us to comprehend. But there's also other benefits for us annotating the text, right? The other benefits could be it will help us prove evidence, right? So when we write our weekly reflections, when we go through and annotate the story, we can use the evidence that we point out in the story as evidence to help us claim what we're talking about in our weekly reflection, right? Because how we discussed last week, how introducing evidence and background information about your claim is crucial to the completion of your paper or your reflection. So if we're doing, especially when we're doing informational text about meaning, let me break that down. Informational text meaning a text that's giving you information about a topic, right? There's no story, there's no characters, there's none of that, right? Everything is straightforward. They're telling us the information in one place about a specific topic. So if I'm doing an informational text on computers, right? They're not going to make up a story about computers that includes characters or robots. The informational text that I'm reading from about the computers could be a handbook, could be a owner's manual, anything like that that tells you exactly what the information about the computer is, and if you have problems, you need to do this, and this to fix it. Okay, so that makes sense. Okay, so let's go ahead and break down this paragraph that I have right here, or this quotation that I have right here, and I'm going to model kind of how I would annotate it. Okay, so let's take my pen. So let's go ahead and read through the story, or this paragraph. Today, most historians and archaeologists agree that other explorers most likely saw the site before Bingham did. However, Bingham was the first to bring the site to the world's attention. So I know this doesn't really have much to go on, but it's just kind of an example that I could show you about how I would annotate the text if I was reading this. So let's go ahead and start at the beginning. So it says, today, most historians. So I'm going to go ahead and put a star next to historians and archaeologists, right? Those are kind of important words to dictate the background knowledge of where we're getting the information from. So let's go ahead and underline historians, and I'm going to underline archaeologists, right? So this is kind of showing that where we're getting that information to be able to, where the information is coming from so that the author was able to write this text, right? So agree that other explorers most likely saw the site before. Site, what do we say right here? What would this be? Say I had a question mark. I didn't understand what that meant. So I'm going to draw a little arrow so I can say site, question mark. And I'm going to write a few bullet points of what I think that means. So I could say a place, a monument, building. All buildings kind of the same as monument. Let's say, what else could site be? Piece of art, right? So these are things that I'm saying the word site could be in reference to the text. So we pointed that out. So we can say that I'm annotating this because I'm not really sure what they're talking about, but I'm saying it could be one of these three things. Before Bingham did. So when I'm looking at the word Bingham, I'm assuming that they're saying that Bingham is a person. And since we're talking about historians and archaeologists, I can infer meaning I can predict or I can assume that Bingham is a historian or an archaeologist, right? So if we're talking about explorers, or we can maybe assume that it's kind of like going to be between these two things, like a place or a monument, because explorers would go to discover these sort of places or monuments, right? And if Bingham is a historian or archaeologist, that can also further go to us for us to assume that this is going to be a place or a monument. Okay, let's go ahead and continue. However, Bingham was the first to bring the site to the world's attention. Okay, so here's that word site again. Let's go ahead and underline it over here. That's that word site again. So we've come to the conclusion that we believe it's either a place or a monument based on what we've read. So this is interesting. World's attention. What do you think that could mean, right? Let's go over here. I'm going to draw an arrow. World's attention. And I'm going to go ahead and put a question mark on it, just like we did for site. And I'm going to put what it could mean. What could that mean, right? So we could say publishing, right? If this was published in a magazine or on TV. Photographed. I'm going to put photos, right? If someone took photos of these and shared these with like the news or in an article or something. World attention. What else could we say? Could be memorialized or documented. Say it was a fossil or something, right? When a fossil is discovered, it's documented and placed into what? A museum. It's shared in articles. So if it's bringing to the world's attention, it could be documented, right? Or it could be published or photos. I think that it could be all of these things, right? So it's really important to see how we broke down the text. We were able to see and read the different things by taking our time, breaking down the words, and really seeing what the text meant. It really helped us gain that information. When we first looked at the text, we weren't able to see all of these points, right? But when we broke it down, we were able to infer what was happening. And I haven't even read the other parts of the text, but I have a good idea of what the article or story is going to be about just by breaking apart this piece of information. It helps me understand what I'm going to read. And it is a good prediction of what the story is going to be about, right? So sometimes annotating a brief piece of information from the story is a way for us as the reader to predict what's to come. Okay, so good job. We're going to go ahead and pick up with our ELA lesson tomorrow when we're going to read the stories, okay? Okay, guys. Let's go ahead and jump straight into our social studies lesson for today. So we are entering into week 22, which is Greek mythology. I'm very excited to talk about this. I really wish we were in the classroom. So we could have incorporated more activities, but unfortunately, due to unforeseen circumstances, we are going to be doing it this way. But I still want to make sure that we are able to fully engage in the learning process about Greek mythology. So, same system as it's been for the last 2 weeks. I'm going to go ahead and read the page of the newspaper that we're discussing today, and then I will go ahead and talk about the three main things that I believe are important for the understanding of the material. So let's go ahead and get started with page 1, which is what we're going to discuss today. I'm going to go ahead and read page 1 first, and then I'll go ahead and write our main points on the board. So I'm going to go ahead and start off at the beginning. The first tab or title that we're reading about is under mythology. So throughout history, many cultures have embraced a belief in gods or goddesses that helps explain the world around them. A culture that believes in only one god or goddess is called monotheistic. The prefix mono means one or only. Polytheism is the worship of a group of gods or goddesses. The prefix poly means many. Ancient Greek was a polytheistic society. The Greeks believed in a large group of gods and goddesses. Myths or stories about these powerful beings helped the Greeks understand the world around them. Greek storytellers wrote myths about god and goddesses, monsters, and heroes, as a way to explain what they noticed about Earth and the environment. Other stories about the gods explained human behavior. The collection of myths within a culture makes up its mythology. Zeus was the most powerful, awe-inspiring, and frightening god in Greek mythology. He was king over the other gods, and he controlled the sky. Zeus lived on Mount Olympus with all the other gods. Because he controlled the sky, he used thunder and lightning to rule the world. Zeus was believed to be wise, fair, and fun-loving, but he also had a temper. Anyone who made him angry had to watch out. Poseidon was Zeus's brother and the god of oceans and other waterways. Statues and paintings of Poseidon often show him carrying a trident and riding through waves and horse-pulled chariot. A trident is a spear that splits into 3 points at the end. Greek myths tell that when Poseidon got angry, he could shake the earth with his trident one moment and calm the ocean the next. Mount Olympus was home to many gods as well. Hera was the queen of Olympus and the goddess of marriage and birth. She sat next to her husband Zeus on a throne of Olympus. Myths about her said that she often became very jealous. Athena was the goddess of wisdom and art. Artemis was the goddess of the moon, force, and hunting. Hestia was the goddess of homes and families. The Greeks didn't tell stories just about their gods. They also told stories about different creatures, monsters, and heroes. The Greeks used these stories to explain the world and why people behaved the way they did. So that's going to be the top of page 1. I'm going to go ahead and read the bottom, which is the connections section. So Olympic Games, then and now. The first Olympic Games were held in 776 BCE. They were part of a religious ceremony that honored Zeus, the king of gods. The Greeks sacrificed 100 oxen during the event at the great altar of Zeus. Ox was Zeus's favorite food. Greek athletes competed in the events like running, boxing, disc throwing, javelin throwing, and chariot racing. Athletes who won were given crowns made of olive branches. The games were held every 4 years. They became so important that the Greeks would stop fighting in wars so that soldiers could compete. Women were not allowed to attend the first Olympic events. Historians are not sure why, but they suspect it may be because the male athletes did not wear any clothes while competing. Many Greek women still wanted to compete, so they formed their own games. They called these events Hera Games, in honor of Hera. Hera is the queen of gods. Women athletes also ran in the races and gave olive wreath crowns to the winners. Today, the Olympics are held biannually, or every 2 years. The Olympics alternate between summer and winter games. Cities all over the world take in turns hosting the events. Not only are both men and women allowed to compete, but athletes with physical or mental disabilities also compete in special events. So that kind of gives us an intro into what the newspaper is going to be about when it dives further into the information. This is kind of just a way for us to obtain the first page knowledge of stuff that we will need in order to read and understand the following 2 pages of the newspaper. So let's go ahead and jump into the first term, monotheistic. So I'm going to say monotheistic is a culture that believes, so culture believes in only one god or goddess, right? So we learned that monotheistic cultures is a culture that believes in only one god or goddess. So they only believe in only one higher power, right? There's no other. Moving on to the next term, polytheism. Polytheism is the worship of a group or god, of a group, so group of gods and goddesses. So Greece is a polytheistic state. So in parentheses, I'm going to write Greece down here because Greece believes in multiple gods and goddesses, right? There's many gods and goddesses that we will learn about in the newspaper and some that we won't, that helped Greek citizens understand the world around them. Like when we read in the first page of the newspaper, this is the belief system and creation of these gods and goddesses were a way for Greek citizens to understand the world around them and why people act the way that they act, right? They created stories, they created lessons, and the ability to learn from past mistakes through the life and tales of certain Greek gods and goddesses that helped the citizens comprehend and understand the world around them. At the time, it was a very difficult place to understand because there was no past knowledge, right? There's no internet, there's no Google, there's no thesaurus, there's no encyclopedia for them to look up what's happening in the world around them. Why does the sun set every night? Why does the ocean come in higher at some points and lower on the other, right? They didn't have an understanding of the word tides. They didn't know about the day and night and the rotation of the earth around the sun, right? They didn't have all of these background information that we as a society today, a way to obtain this information. So in order for them to understand what was happening in the world around them, they used stories of Greek gods and goddesses. And when you look back at these stories, we could see the direct relations to today's world. Like when we talked about last week, when we talked about the goddess of Persephone, who lived half of her life in the underworld with Hades and half of her life on earth with her mother, and how when Persephone was in the underworld, nothing grew, everything, all the leaves fell off, everything was bare. And when she was up in the world, everything grew and blossomed. Flowers grew, vegetables grew, all of this kind of grew. And we understand that today as our seasons, right? But back then, when the story was created and when the story was told, Greek citizens didn't have a way to understand seasons. They didn't have a way to understand how the earth worked and how it, as it rotates on its axles, it changed seasons, right? It brought different aspects. But when us as a society in our world today look at these stories that were created back in these times where Greek goddesses and goddesses were so prevalent, and where there's monuments and events that were held to honor them that were being built at the time, we can really see those connections in our world today. So from looking at that story, we understand that this was their way of understanding what was happening in the world, in the earth, when it was going through the different seasons. Well, nowadays we know that there's different seasons, that there's 4 different seasons, but when we read the story, we can easily see the connections that are being told between the two. Okay, so let's go on to the connections. The Olympic Games. What are the Olympic Games, right? So we could say sporting event. So the Greeks invented the Olympic Games, right? So we could say Greeks invented, I'm going to underline invented in a second. Invented meaning what? Created. Were the first to engage, were the first to create and introduce such event, right? Invented the Olympic Games. So the Olympic Games had very many similarities to what they are today, right? However, there are many differences as well, right? So when we're looking at it, there was only a few games and events that were held during the Olympic Games when they were created in Greece. They had events such as javelin, boxing, running, disc throwing, chariot racing. And when we look at our Olympic Games today, we can see several of those games that were used in their Olympic Games are still being used in today, right? We have running, we have javelin, we have disc throwing, right? We have all of these things still today that were used in the original Olympic Games during the ancient Greek time. There are some differences, however, in the original Olympic Games during the Greek civilization. Women were not allowed to attend the event, and they eventually ended up holding their own Olympic Games, and they called it the Heraia Games, I think, after the Greek goddess Hera, right, who was Zeus's wife. So women had their own games with the same events, but just for the only women, right? And the Olympic Games were only male. However, as the years progressed and generations and obviously have passed throughout the years, everything is now one. So, and the Olympic Games have evolved into such an incredible sporting event designed to bring together the world in unifying the love for sports and how it can change lives and be a way for kids and adults to express themselves and use as a tool to help in their development as a human. So when we're looking at the changes that the Olympic Games have made when they're talked about to this day, we talk about how there's 2, right? There's the summer games and then there's the winter games. Winter games being when skiing, ice skating, all of these other stuff, snowboarding, toboggans, all of these other events that are held only during the winter games when the season allows for the snow to be on the ground. During the summer games, we have games such as gymnastics, basketball, wrestling, swimming, all of these games, events that were being held in summertime when the weather persists and allows for these events to happen. You can really see how back then when they only had 6 or 7 events now turns into when they have 20, 30, 40 events in our Olympic Games. Actually, this was the year 2020. We were supposed to have the Summer Olympic Games this year, right? This summer in Tokyo. However, due to unforeseen circumstances of COVID-19, it's moved to next year. So 2021, next summer, we will have the Tokyo Olympic Games. And it's really incredible to see the opportunity and be able to see the different events that are held during this time. And we can see the games and we can see our community, our world, coming together to celebrate these events, these sporting events, and coming together as a society and seeing these incredible talent by these young athletes. So I think it's amazing to see how an event that was used to honor Zeus back in ancient Greece is now an event that brings our world together. So let's go ahead and wrap up page 1 here, and then I will see you guys in the morning for tomorrow's lesson.